It seems like you guys really enjoyed episode 0 of Arifureta. So, as promised, here's mostly everything that the anime skipped from the masterpiece that was episode 1. This time covering more about Hajime and Kaori's past, including why Kaori seems to be so interested in Hajime. Then diving deeper, in some ways quite literally, into the world of Tortoise and the great Orcus Labyrinth. But first, this video is sponsored by Surfshark, which honestly is one of the best modern VPNs that I've used to date. Not only is it highly secure with numerous features that go into protecting your identity, like the Clean Web tool that actively protects your session from ads, malware, and phishing attempts, but it also allows an unlimited number of devices to use the VPN at the same time without any repercussions, all of which can be done with the single tap of a button because of how simple their client interface is to use. For me personally, that means that I can use Surfshark to access anime on Netflix that otherwise wouldn't be available in Canada, which does include Japan's fairly extensive selection, but there are no subtitles. Even so, I can watch them on my desktop then switch to mobile whenever I see fit, but that's mainly what I use it for. There's a whole lot more features that I've barely even covered, and you can check them out yourself by using the link surfshark.deal/AniNews to get 83% off a 2-year plan plus an additional free month. This makes the subscription only cost $1.99 a month, and even if you don't like it, you can get your money back within 30 days. So that's surfshark.deal/AniNews to start your more secure and versatile online experience. Now, let's get back to the video. Episode 1, The Monster of the Abyss, covering pretty much half of the entire first volume of the novels and 6 whole chapters from the manga. If you recall from last episode, Captain Meld had just brought the students to the outpost town of Horad so that everyone could gain some infield experience within the great Orcus Labyrinth, though the deepest floor that they could confidently go was to the 20th. It was known as the floor that separated the skilled adventurers from the amateurs. The deepest anyone had ever gone was to floor 65, however, no one had been able to reach those depths in a while. Even getting to floor 40 was considered to be a superhuman feat, so the 20th floor became known as the standard level to indicate one's skill. For the time that this labyrinth has existed, every floor down till the 47th was completely mapped out. But because each floor spanned a few kilometers in every direction, it took at least a month or two to completely map a new one. Though, just having the first 20 floors mapped out significantly reduces the amount of danger that any of them would face while traversing the dungeon. Now, this expedition wasn't scheduled for till the day after, so Hajime was just spending his time laying in this small bedroom at the inn, pondering all that could happen while in the dungeon. It was around 1 or 2 a.m. when he finally decided to go to bed, but that's when he heard a knock on the door. It was a bit strange because although this time at night wouldn't be considered late for him, to the average person, this wasn't a standard time to be awake, so he was suspicious at who it could be. And even more so when he opened the door to see that it was Kaori standing there. She wanted to come in and talk, and as much as Hajime wanted to say no, he just couldn't deny the cute face that Kaori was putting on. As we saw, Kaori was pleading with Hajime to not go down to the dungeon because of the foreboding dreams that she'd been having. But what we didn't see was when she brought up the story of how she first met Hajime. Well, more like noticed rather than formally met. It was back in junior high, and a young kid was getting bullied by some thug. Kaori was there watching the situation unfold, but was too scared to intervene. She hoped that one of the adults passing by would step in to help, but everyone just kept walking. Hajime was there as well, and although he was scared to the bone, he just couldn't stand by and do nothing. When he saw that the thug was about to start beating on the kid, Hajime threw himself at the thug's feet and wouldn't let go. This actually worked, and it helped to defuse the situation, but to Hajime, he merely thought of it as some pathetic display of weakness. I mean, all he really did was just kneel in the middle of the street. Kaori, though, she was amazed. She saw it as some incredible feat of strength. You see, standing up to someone is easy when you're stronger than them, but when you're weak, it takes a whole lot more strength to put yourself in that same position. So when Kaori saw Hajime stand up to someone who was quite visibly much stronger than him, she was astonished by his act of courage. And from that day forward, she considered him to be the strongest person that she knew, which is why she was so happy to find out that they were going to the same middle school together. She'd tried day after day to become friends with him, but whenever she'd attempt to start a conversation, he'd always dismiss it or just be sleeping. Hajime never knew that Kaori saw him this way. Everything was finally starting to make sense, and he knew now why Kaori always showed so much interest, and it's why she was worried about him now. If Hajime does something reckless to protect someone else like how he did for that kid, then things might not end the same way as it did with that thug. Kaori couldn't bear the thought of something bad happening to Hajime, but deep down she knew that it was a futile ask. She could tell that Hajime was working hard to assist his classmates in any way that he could. There was no way he was going to let everyone go without him. But Hajime knew that he was weak as well, which is why they came up with the compromise of having Kaori protect him. When the next morning came, Hajime expected the labyrinth's entrance to just be a simple opening into a cave, but instead, it was like the entrance to a museum. Giant pillars and an arch created a massive opening into the downward leading dungeon, and all along the outskirts were shops, adventurers, and a few shady people either conversing with each other or trying to sell their goods. At the entrance, there seemed to be a receptionist-type lady. She was there to check the status plate of every person walking into the dungeon. You see, the government put in place a plate check policy in order to avoid losing too many men. It was a process run by the local guild, since the government was too busy with preparing for war. Now, everything seemed so lively on the outside, but once they were in the dungeon itself, the atmosphere was completely different. Much less people were around them, and the walls were all dimly lit by a special mineral called green glowstone. In fact, the entire labyrinth was an excavated vein of that very ore. As such, it made it possible to see their surroundings without a torch or magic item. It didn't take very long after venturing deeper into the first floor to come across their first set of monsters. Quick but weak creatures known as ratmen stood before them. Everyone rushed into formation. Koki's group of combat specialists held the front line, while Kaori's group of mages cast some spells from range. Because Koki was a knight, he was given a sword artifact known as the Holy Sword. It was blessed with the element of light, and had magical properties that not only boosted his physical strength, but also weakened any enemy that was struck by the light. Ryutaro was a monk, meaning he fought with his fists. His equipment were also artifacts with magical properties. A pair of unbreakable gauntlets and greaves that were capable of unleashing enchanted shockwaves. Finally, Shizuku was a swordsman, so she wielded a blade that seemed like a cross between a katana and a shamshir. Her sheer skill with the sword gained her a lot of recognition with the Tortoise Knights. It was these three offensive specialists combined with the support of the mages that allowed them to reach the 20th floor without any issues. In fact, the only threat that anyone faced was the traps scattered throughout the dungeon. To counter this, the soldiers had a tool to detect them known as a fair scope. It read the flow of mana that these magically based traps would emit, though it could only detect around 80% of them due to its limited range. That's why before entering any room, the knights first had to clear it by scanning for any traps. They eventually reached the final parts of the 20th floor, and the tunnel walls became narrow, resulting in everyone having to go single file and break formation. In the distance, Meld noticed a monster camouflaging along the wall. It was the beefier Ratman that we see in the anime, formerly known as a rock mount. Contrary to what we saw, it wasn't Hajime that it was attacking, but rather the girls in the back, which is why Koki used such a powerful attack like Celestial Flash to cut it clean in half. The attack was so strong that the force struck the wall behind it to reveal the gem known as a glance crystal. These didn't have any special properties or anything, but they were rather popular amongst the nobles as jewelry. In fact, it was one of the top 3 jewels used in proposal rings. When Kaori heard this, she couldn't help but comment on how lovely that sounded, all while quickly stealing a glance in Hajime's direction. It was so quick that no one should have noticed, and no one did, except for those who were already looking at her. That would be Shizuku and Hiyama. Yup, Hiyama saw this and couldn't help but feel a little bit jealous, so he just outright said that he'll go get her the jewel. Then, as you know, the gem was a trap that teleported everyone straight to the 65th floor, dropping them on a bridge where on one end was the behemoth and at the other, a horde of skeletons known as Trom soldiers. The knights recognized the skeletons as creatures common to the 38th floor, so that made them the easier of the two enemies to face. I mean, the behemoth was a creature that not even the legendary adventurer who made it this far could beat, putting Meld in a position where he had no choice but to cast the impenetrable barrier spell known as Hallowed Ground. Though this would only buy them about a minute's worth of time since the spell didn't last very long. The beast charged the barrier, and the barrier did its job. But the impact shook the bridge, and many of the students began to panic. One of the girls fell forward, right in front of a Trom soldier. It was about to strike her with its sword when the ground that it was standing on began to crumble. A massive pit opened up, and many Trom soldiers fell into the abyss below. Turns out, Hajime had used his transmutation to protect this girl. It was an effective method of eliminating many Trom soldiers at once, so he continued to do so while keeping an eye on his surroundings. Everything was a mess. All the students were either swinging their swords or firing spells at random. If this went on much longer, then someone was definitely going to end up dying. What they needed now was a leader. someone who could provide hope and clear the fear that all these students were currently facing. Of course, it couldn't be himself, so he ran to the best person that he could think of, Koki. You see, all this time, Koki was arguing with Meld trying to get permission to take on the behemoth. But Meld refused over and over, which only made Koki frustrated. It didn't help that Ryutaro was there boosting his ego as well. So when Hajime came by, he grabbed Koki by the collar and started yelling some sense back into him. Seeing the quietest student berating him made Koki realize the situation that he and his classmates were currently facing. He decided to accept the role that Hajime gave him, but before he could get to the other side of the bridge, the barrier's time limit was up, and the beast charged headfirst into them. Hajime transmuted a wall to lessen the force of the impact, but it still sent those who were on the front line flying backward, immobilizing Meld and many of the other knights. Koki saw this as his opportunity to step up, so he got Shizuku and Ryutaro to support him while he cast his strongest spell, Divine Wrath. It was similar to Celestial Flash, just much larger. The light from his sword enveloped the entire monster, but once everything settled, not a single scratch could be seen on it. The only thing different about the behemoth was that it now seemed angry. Its body began to seep out dark red mana, and it gave off such a murderous glare that even Koki thought he was going to die. Everyone began to retreat as the beast readied itself for another charge. It made its biggest impact yet, and the shockwave paralyzed many of the students including Koki. Only Hajime, Meld, Kaori, and a few other knights were able to move easily. Everyone else was on the floor trying to recover. Now, considering the dire situation, Meld grit his teeth as he had no choice but to give Kaori and Hajime the order to prioritize Koki's escape over everyone else's. You see, Meld was willing to give up everyone else, including himself, if it meant that Koki would live. That's just how valuable he was. Hajime just couldn't accept an order like that, so he proposed another idea that would focus the danger around himself. It was the very thing that Kaori wanted to avoid, but seeing as this could be the only way to save everyone, Meld accepted it. Hajime ran straight towards the behemoth. When Kaori saw this, she tried her best to call Hajime back, slowly becoming more and more distraught as Meld just told her to focus on healing Koki. Reason being that Koki was the key to everyone else's survival. Aside from Meld himself, he was the next strongest among them, so his strength would be needed to safely guide everyone out of the dungeon. Meld had to reassure Kaori that this was all part of the plan. She really had no choice but to believe him, and finally cast Heaven's Blessing on Koki. This was a high-level healing spell that not only healed wounds but also restored mana. With this, it didn't take long for Koki to be back at fighting strength, and once fully recovered, he immediately cleared the 200 Tromp soldiers that were standing in front of him, all with a single Celestial Flash. The path was only cleared for a moment, as many more Trom began to immediately spawn. Many of the students were still panicking, believing that their situation was hopeless. I mean, it really was nothing short of a miracle that none of them had died yet. But this time Meld took the lead, and he cleared the new wave of Trom with a move that was even more powerful than Koki's. This seemed to give a little bit of hope to the students, as they looked as if they were gaining a bit of confidence. But in actuality, it was due to a mental focus spell that Kaori had cast. The students began to remember their training, and started to follow Meld's orders as he gave them, eventually securing their path of escape barely moments before Hajime's transmutation could no longer hold the behemoth. This brings us back to the anime, where we see Hajime running from the behemoth only to get hit by a stray fireball spell, ultimately leading to his descent into the abyss. Everything after that is shown from Hajime's perspective. What we didn't see though was the story of how the surviving students escaped from the labyrinth. Cause remember, not only are they highly underleveled for the area that they're in, but they're also 18 floors deep in uncharted territory. So how exactly did they make it out alive? Well, let's start from right after Koki fell to his supposed death. Kaori was in such a state of disarray that she had to be knocked unconscious by Meld. Otherwise, she would have just followed Hajime right into the abyss. She refused to believe that Hajime was gone. It just wasn't something that her mind could comprehend. But their current focus needed to be on surviving, and that's really all that mattered now. So it was the best course of action to prevent the loss of anyone else. The students peered up at the stairs, and it looked as if it went on forever, just leading upward to an endless tunnel of darkness. They must have been climbing for hours before finally coming across a magic circle imprinted on a wall. It showed no signs of being a trap, so Meld activated it to see what would happen. A secret corridor opened up, which led straight to a room on the 20th floor. Everyone let out a breath of relief. Even Koki was leaning over himself since he could finally relax. But they still weren't safe yet. It was too soon to stop and rest since they still had 20 more floors to ascend. They avoided as many fights as possible, and the fights that they did have to take on, the knights took care of. Eventually, they did reach the main gates. Many students collapsed out of exhaustion, or just sheer relief, and they didn't want to do anything other than go to their rooms and call it a day. So while everyone returned to the inn, one person stayed behind to visit the town. He went and found a spot where he was sure that no one could hear or see him. Then he squatted down and buried his face in his legs, in a way that if you saw him from behind, you'd be sure that this person was depressed. In reality, this student was ecstatic over what he had just accomplished, and he was giddy over the fact that he had just taken out his supposed love rival, chalking up his actions to some form of deserved divine punishment. As he snickered away in the corner, one classmate approached him and immediately called him out for being the murderer, stating how they never would have thought that the first murderer they'd meet in another world would be their own classmate. But this person wasn't scolding him. Instead, they were, in a roundabout kind of way, blackmailing Hajime to become their slave. Not that they needed anything right now, but there was something that this person wanted, and they needed help to get it. So when the time comes, Hajime has to help this person. Otherwise, Kaori would be the first to find out who killed Hajime. As for who this mystery classmate was, well, that will remain just that, a mystery. So that brings us to about halfway through episode 1. But rather than spend another 15 minutes finishing that, I think this is a good place to stop and split the video into 2 parts. Otherwise, this video wouldn't have come out this weekend. As you can tell, we still got plenty more to cover. So if you want to see more of this, then feel free to drop a like or comment so that I know to keep this series going. Now, before I go, I'd like to thank Surfshark once again for sponsoring this video. In my opinion, they really do offer one of the best modern VPN platforms to date. So if you're looking for a highly reliable and secure VPN, then you can use surfshark.deal/AniNews to get 83% off that 2-year plan today. Anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!